Welcome to Arsenal, where the weapons and war machines of military history come to life. Today, we explore the KC-135 Stratotanker, the aerial refueling workhorse of the Cold War and beyond, and the crews whose steady work turned fuel into global reach. A longer print edition of this story, with fact sheets and photos, is available on LinkedIn or by email. Arsenal is the Friday feature of Dispatch, U.S. military history magazine, developed by trackpads.com.
The night sky over the Persian Gulf is clear but busy. Far below, burning oil wells stain the horizon with a dull orange glow. High above, a KC-135 Stratotanker rides a long, invisible racetrack in the dark, engines humming while the crew watches instruments and the black sky beyond the cockpit glass. They have been here for hours during Operation Desert Storm, a lone aluminum gas station in hostile airspace.
Off the nose, tiny wingtip strobes begin to grow. A flight of strike aircraft, low on fuel after hunting Iraqi targets, climbs toward the rendezvous. In the rear of the tanker, the boom operator lies prone at his station and looks through the window at the dark air behind the aircraft. As the fighters slide into position, he extends the refueling boom and guides it with precise fingertip movements toward the first receiver's receptacle.
When the connection is made, thousands of pounds of fuel begin to flow. The receiver pilot's fuel worries ease. The aircraft can return safely, and it may launch again before dawn because the tanker crew stayed on station long enough to top it off. Far from cameras focused on bombs and strike packages, the KC-135 is doing what it has done for decades, turning range into strategy and keeping bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance aircraft in the fight.
The KC-135 story begins in the tense early Cold War, when the U.S. Air Force faced a simple problem with enormous consequences. Its bombers and jet fighters could not be in the right place at the right time without reliable fuel in the sky. Strategic Air Command wanted nuclear-armed bombers that could reach targets deep inside the Soviet Union and, if needed, loiter on airborne alert. Tactical air forces needed fighters that could deploy across oceans and remain on station over distant battlefields.
The existing tanker fleet was not built for that jet-age mission. Most tankers were converted propeller-driven transports that flew too low and too slowly for the newest bombers and fighters. A bomber forced to descend and slow down behind an older tanker gave up some of the speed and altitude that helped it survive. Fighters crossing the Atlantic or Pacific still depended on chains of bases, island stops, and good weather. In a crisis, those delays could decide whether a squadron arrived in time.
Geography made fuel a weapon. The Cold War world had long distances, limited friendly airfields, and political limits on where aircraft could be based or fly. Air planners could draw bold routes across maps, but without fuel at the right altitude, speed, and location, those lines were only wishes. The Air Force needed a jet-powered tanker able to cruise with the B-52 and modern fighters, carry enough fuel to matter, and be reliable enough to build and fly in large numbers.
The need also changed how commanders thought about deterrence. A bomber force on paper was not enough if aircraft could not reach targets, return from missions, or remain airborne through a crisis. Tankers allowed bombers to launch with useful payloads instead of filling every margin with fuel. They also allowed fighters to move rapidly between theaters without waiting for every intermediate base to be ready. In that sense, aerial refueling became a form of strategic infrastructure carried in the air.
That requirement led to a purpose-built swept-wing jet tanker. Boeing had already taken a private gamble with the Model 367-80, a prototype jet transport meant to show that swept-wing jet technology was ready for airlines and the Air Force. Strategic Air Command saw in that aircraft a chance to solve the refueling problem in one move. Instead of converting another propeller transport, the Air Force could buy a tanker designed from the beginning around speed, altitude, and fuel transfer.
Designers had to make trade-offs. A wider fuselage would have been better for passengers, but Strategic Air Command cared more about fuel and performance. A heavier structure could carry more, but extra weight cut into range and climb. The chosen design used a relatively narrow fuselage, swept wings, and 4 turbojet engines under the wings. Inside, tanks, pumps, valves, and the rigid flying boom were arranged around the refueling mission.
At a glance, the KC-135 Stratotanker is a 4-engine jet tanker built in the United States and serving primarily with the U.S. Air Force from the late 1950s onward. Its typical crew included 2 pilots, a navigator in early variants, and a boom operator, with room for other specialists or passengers when needed. Its main job is to transfer large amounts of fuel in flight through a controllable boom and, in some configurations, hose and drogue equipment for aircraft that refuel differently.
Production moved quickly once the concept was approved. Hundreds of KC-135s entered service as the Air Force shifted into the jet age. They spread across air refueling wings in the United States, Europe, and the Pacific. The basic airframe was built to last, with room for later engines, avionics, defensive equipment, and new refueling requirements.
Walk up to a KC-135, and the first impression is a lean, purposeful aircraft. The long, narrow fuselage, swept wings, modest tail, and 4 engine pods give it a transport-like outline, but the refueling boom under the tail reveals its true purpose. Service panels along the belly and sides hint at the fuel lines and valves inside. From the outside, it may look plain, but almost every major feature supports putting fuel into another aircraft at the right place and time. The forward fuselage holds a compact, workmanlike cockpit. The aircraft commander and co-pilot sit among engine gauges, navigation displays, radios, and flight instruments. In early decades, the navigator worked from a station with charts and plotting tools. Later avionics and satellite navigation reduced that role, but the mission remained a team effort. Behind the cockpit are seats, planning areas, and communication equipment that keep the tanker tied to air traffic control and receiver aircraft. Inside the cockpit, the mission could last for many hours, and fatigue management became part of professional discipline. Crews monitored fuel loads, weather, receiver timing, radio calls, and airspace restrictions, while holding to a schedule that might support dozens of aircraft. A tanker arriving late could leave receivers anxious or force an entire strike package to adjust. A tanker arriving early but burning too much fuel could reduce what it had available to give away. Precision was not only a matter of flying the boom, it began with every route, altitude, and throttle setting.
The boom operator's station sits low in the rear fuselage. In the original arrangement, the operator lies on a padded couch and looks through windows at the receiver aircraft below and behind the tanker. Hand controllers move the boom in small corrections, while instruments show fuel flow and connection status. Later improvements added better optics and displays, but the essential task stayed the same. Guide the boom into a small receptacle on another aircraft, sometimes in turbulence, darkness, or combat pressure.
For the receiver pilot, the tanker was both target and refuge. Closing from behind required discipline because a heavy aircraft's wake, darkness, turbulence, and low fuel state could all raise the pressure. The KC-135 crew had to make the process feel predictable. Clear radio calls, stable airspeed, steady turns, and a calm boom operator helped turn a difficult airborne rendezvous into a procedure crews could trust even late in a long mission.
The rest of the aircraft blends fuel system and human workspace. There are tank bays, inspection areas, cargo positions in some configurations, fold-down seats, storage for meals and gear, and the constant background of engine noise, airflow, jet fuel, warm electronics, and coffee. Training can make refueling look smooth, But real crews deal with fatigue, weather, and receiver aircraft that behave differently behind the tanker. A heavy bomber does not fly like a fighter, and the tanker crew must hold a steady platform while knowing when to disconnect if the approach becomes unsafe.
Every refueling mission was also a planning problem. The tanker had to be where the receiver expected it, with enough fuel left to give away and enough reserve to return safely. Weather, enemy threats, changing target assignments, and delayed aircraft could all disrupt the schedule. Good tanker operations looked calm because crews had already solved dozens of invisible problems before the receiver ever appeared behind the tail.
The KC-135's first true combat test came over Southeast Asia. By the mid-1960s, U.S. bombers flew from Guam and Thailand toward targets in North Vietnam and Laos, often on missions lasting 16 hours or more. Without tankers, a B-52 had to trade bombs for fuel or operate from positions closer to danger. With KC-135s orbiting along the route, bombers could launch heavy, refuel, strike, and top off again on the way home.
Fighter bombers depended on the tankers as well. F-105s and F-4s stretched their time over the battlefield by taking fuel above the jungle, often with anti-aircraft fire and surface-to-air missiles not far away. Tankers tried to stay outside the densest threats, but combat rarely followed perfect boundaries. In some cases, KC-135s escorted damaged aircraft out of hostile airspace, feeding them fuel as they limped toward safety. The boom became a lifeline.
Those years fixed the Stratotanker's reputation as a force multiplier rather than a headline maker. Receiver pilots remembered the calm voice of the boom operator and the sight of the tanker's belly at the end of a long mission. When Vietnam wound down, the KC-135 did not move to the margins. It supported Bomber Alert, NATO exercises, long-range deployments, and the daily work of connecting global air power with fuel.
Southeast Asia also gave the tanker community a culture of quiet responsibility. The aircraft rarely appeared in dramatic combat footage, but missions depended on it. Every bomber formation, fighter strike, reconnaissance route, and rescue support plan had fuel assumptions behind it. If the tanker plan failed, the visible mission could fail as well. That lesson carried forward into later wars, where the KC-135 often remained outside the spotlight while enabling almost everything that made headlines.
By Operation Desert Storm in early 1991, KC-135 crews had decades of real-world experience. The air campaign against Iraq required a web of refueling tracks over Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, supporting everything from aircraft launched from the United States to strike packages flying from carriers and forward bases. Tankers formed the silent scaffolding beneath the famous air campaign. Later operations over the Balkans, Afghanistan, and Iraq repeated the pattern, with new aircraft but familiar tanker call signs.
Desert Storm demonstrated that aerial refueling was no longer just a strategic bomber requirement. It had become part of the daily rhythm of conventional war. Strike aircraft, air defense fighters, reconnaissance platforms, and command and control aircraft all used tankers to extend time, distance, and flexibility. The KC-135 was not the newest aircraft in the sky, but it was one of the reasons so many newer aircraft could keep operating. The aircraft's strengths begin with reliability and reach. Its swept wings and jet engines let it refuel bombers and fighters at useful altitudes and speeds. Its internal fuel capacity allowed a single tanker to top off several receivers, or give one bomber the fuel needed for a demanding mission. In good conditions, refueling behind a well-flown KC-135 could feel routine, which says a great deal about the stability of the platform and the maturity of its procedures.
Re-engining programs made the aircraft more capable. Many early KC-135A models with turbojet engines became KC-135R or KC-135T aircraft with modern high-bypass turbofans. These engines improved fuel efficiency, reduced noise, and allowed tankers to offload more fuel. KC-135E models served as another interim step before leaving the inventory as the R and T versions became the standard.
The weaknesses became clearer with age. The narrow fuselage and fuel-focused design gave the KC-135 less cargo and passenger flexibility than later multi-role tankers, such as the KC-10 and KC-46. Older engines were loud and thirsty, and even upgraded aircraft carried the burdens of corrosion, wiring age, and structural fatigue. Maintenance hours rose as the airframes passed decades of service. The basic cockpit layout came from a mid-20th century jet, even as avionics upgrades made it more modern.
Commanders also understood that tankers were high-value targets. A single tanker lost or driven away could disrupt a whole day of strike and reconnaissance missions. The KC-135 normally depended on distance, timing, fighter cover, and air superiority, rather than stealth. In any future fight against a peer adversary with long-range missiles, that vulnerability matters, which is one reason newer tankers are entering service even while the Stratotanker remains active.
The aircraft's age made the modernization story complicated. Keeping old airframes useful required inspections, structural repairs, wiring work, cockpit updates, and careful decisions about which aircraft deserved the next investment. The reward was continuity. Crews could keep using a known platform while improvements arrived gradually. The risk was that every year added more maintenance burden and made the replacement question harder to avoid. Over time, the fleet evolved in engines, avionics, navigation, communications, and refueling flexibility. Some aircraft gained equipment to support probe and drove receivers, making them more useful with Navy, Marine, and coalition aircraft. Related C-135 airframes became reconnaissance platforms, command posts, and test aircraft. Inside the Air Force, replacement planning has to be gradual because daily refueling commitments cannot simply stop while newer aircraft arrive.
The transition to newer tankers does not erase the Stratotanker's importance. It shows how successful the original concept was. Few aircraft remain central to frontline operations for so long unless the basic design solves a deep and continuing problem. The KC-135 did that by making fuel mobile, flexible, and available in the sky. The KC-135's legacy rests less on single dramatic moments than on countless missions that worked. It allowed bombers and fighters to cross oceans without landing, loiter over remote battlefields, and respond quickly to crises. From Vietnam through the Gulf War and post-September 11th operations, tankers made it possible to base aircraft where politics and infrastructure allowed, while still reaching distant targets. In doctrine, the aircraft changed how planners thought about distance and time. Air campaigns could be designed around the best routes and timing rather than internal fuel alone, because tankers could knit the pieces together. Preserved KC-135s now stand at air parks, base gates, and museums across the United States, often overshadowed by bombers and fighters, but essential to understanding how modern air forces work. Above all, the Stratotanker's story belongs to crews who spent long hours on dark refueling tracks, and to pilots who felt relief when a gray tanker appeared just as their fuel gauges slid toward empty.